Back in the golden age of American diners, long before fast food windows and frozen breakfasts took over, there were tiny roadside cafes where exhausted factory workers, truck drivers, young mothers, and tired couples gathered before sunrise. The smell of sizzling butter, black coffee, and crispy potatoes filled the air while old jukeboxes quietly played in the corner. Some breakfasts were so filling, so comforting, and so cheap that families survived on them during the hardest years in America. But today, most of these dishes have completely vanished. Tonight, here on America's Lost Recipes, we're bringing back 10 forgotten diner breakfasts that once sat on nearly every counter across the country. Some were created during the Great Depression. Others became symbols of small-town America in the 1940s and 50s. And a few may look strange to modern audiences, but they carried memories that millions never forgot. As we go through this list, I want you to imagine yourself sitting inside a warm vintage diner at 5 a.m. while rain taps against the windows and the cook calls out another order from the grill. And before we begin, tell me something in the comments. Which decade do you wish you could eat breakfast in, the 1930s, 40s, or 50s? If nostalgic American food history feels like home to you, make sure to subscribe to America's Lost Recipes, like the video, and stay with us until the end, because some of these forgotten breakfasts are far more surprising than anyone remembers. Part 01, Creamed Chipped Beef on Toast. Long before avocado toast and fast food breakfast sandwiches became normal, one humble diner meal quietly filled millions of American stomachs during some of the hardest years in history. It was called creamed chipped beef on toast, though many exhausted factory workers and soldiers simply called it SOS. The dish looked plain at first glance. Dried beef sliced into salty ribbons, mixed into thick white gravy, then poured over crispy toast. But inside old American diners during the 1940s and 50s, this meal was everywhere. The reason was simple. It was cheap, filling, and incredibly easy to make during times when families counted every coin. Diners could stretch small amounts of dried beef into large servings, feeding workers before long shifts at factories, railroads, and steel mills. The smell of butter and peppered gravy drifting through the diner at sunrise became part of everyday American life. During World War II, the breakfast became even more famous after being heavily served in military kitchens across the country. Thousands of young soldiers ate it before training, and many later returned home craving the same comforting taste they remembered from Army mess halls. Small-town diners quickly embraced it, serving the dish beside black coffee and fried potatoes for only a few cents. But by the 1970s, the breakfast slowly disappeared. Younger generations viewed it as old-fashioned poverty food, and many diners removed it from their menus forever. Today, most Americans under 30 have never even heard of it. Yet for older generations, one bite of creamed chipped beef still brings back memories of cold mornings, crowded diners, hardworking families, and a version of America that quietly faded away decades ago. Part 02, Cornmeal Mush and Maple Syrup. Before sugary cereals filled grocery store shelves, many American families woke up to a breakfast that looked unbelievably simple. It was called cornmeal mush, a thick mixture made by slowly boiling cornmeal in water or milk until it became soft and heavy enough to slice. In small-town diners across the Midwest and rural America, cooks would chill it overnight, cut it into squares the next morning, then fry it on a sizzling cast-iron grill until the outside turned golden and crisp. The finished meal was usually served with butter, maple syrup, or sometimes only a sprinkle of sugar if money was tight. During the Great Depression, this breakfast became a lifeline for struggling families because cornmeal was cheap, filling, and available almost everywhere. One large pot could feed an entire household before school or long hours of physical labor. Inside old American diners during the 1930s and 40s, plates of fried mush often sat beside black coffee and bacon grease-fried eggs. Farmers especially loved it because the meal stayed heavy in the stomach for hours while working in fields from sunrise until dark. Some diners even served mush with sausage gravy instead of syrup, creating a savory version now nearly forgotten. But as processed breakfast foods exploded in popularity after the 1950s, cornmeal mush slowly vanished from menus. Younger Americans wanted quicker meals that felt modern and fashionable. The old-fashioned breakfast many grandparents grew up eating suddenly became associated with poverty and hard times. Today, only a handful of rural diners still serve true fried cornmeal mush the traditional way. Yet for many older Americans, the smell of crisp cornmeal frying in butter instantly brings back memories of snowy mornings, crowded kitchens, and families gathering around tiny diner tables before another difficult day began. Part 03: Scrapple and Eggs. In the early mornings of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and other parts of the American Northeast, diner grills once crackled with a breakfast that many modern Americans would barely recognize today. It was called scrapple, a strange-looking loaf made from pork scraps, cornmeal, flour, and spices, sliced thick and fried until the outside became dark and crispy, while the inside stayed soft and rich. To outsiders, scrapple sounded unusual, even unsettling. But during the Great Depression and the difficult years that followed, wasting food was unthinkable. Families used every possible piece of meat they could afford, and scrapple became one of the most practical breakfasts in working-class America. Nothing was thrown away. Every ingredient had value. In old roadside diners, cooks placed slices of scrapple directly onto greasy cast-iron grills beside eggs, toast, and fried potatoes. The smell was unforgettable. Smoky pork mixed with butter and black pepper drifting through crowded dining rooms before sunrise. Truck drivers, factory workers, coal miners, and farmers often ordered it because the meal was cheap, heavy, and kept them full for hours. For many children growing up in the 1940s and 50s, weekend mornings meant hearing the sharp sizzling sound of scrapple frying in the kitchen while parents poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. Some people covered it in syrup, while others ate it with ketchup or apple butter depending on local traditions. But by the late 20th century, scrapple slowly disappeared outside small regional diners. Younger generations viewed it as old-fashioned country food connected to poverty and survival cooking. Many Americans today have never tasted it at all. Yet in the few diners that still serve authentic scrapple and eggs, older customers often say the first bite feels like stepping directly back into childhood, into a colder, tougher, but strangely comforting version of America that no longer exists. Part 04: Tomato Gravy and Biscuits. In many Southern American diners, there was once a breakfast so simple that outsiders could hardly believe people survived on it for generations. It was called tomato gravy and biscuits, a warm, comforting meal made from flour, bacon grease, canned tomatoes, and freshly baked biscuits pulled straight from the oven before sunrise. During the Great Depression, meat was often too expensive for struggling families. But tomatoes could be canned during summer and stored through winter, making them one of the few dependable ingredients poor households always kept nearby. Southern cooks learned how to transform those basic pantry items into thick, savory gravy poured over soft biscuits that could feed an entire family for almost nothing. Inside old roadside diners during the 1930s and 40s, plates of tomato gravy became common among mill workers, railroad employees, and farmers heading toward long, exhausting days. The rich smell of bacon grease mixed with simmering tomatoes filled tiny kitchens before daylight even appeared outside. Some diners added black pepper or onions for extra flavor, while others kept the recipe extremely plain because every ingredient mattered during hard times. For many Southern children, this breakfast carried emotional memories far beyond the food itself. Families gathered around worn wooden tables while parents stretched tiny grocery budgets as far as possible. Even when cupboards looked nearly empty, tomato gravy and biscuits somehow appeared on the table. But after post-war prosperity arrived in America, the humble breakfast slowly disappeared from mainstream diners. Younger generations preferred bacon platters, pancakes, and processed breakfast foods that felt more modern. Tomato gravy became associated with poverty, rural life, and difficult memories many families tried to leave behind. Today, only a handful of old-fashioned Southern diners still serve authentic tomato gravy and biscuits. Yet for older Americans, the taste instantly brings back memories of warm kitchens, hard-working parents, and mornings when simple food carried entire families through uncertain times. Part 05: Fried Bologna and Eggs. Long before expensive breakfast platters became common in America, countless diners served a simple meal that working families depended on almost every morning: fried bologna and eggs. Thick slices of bologna were tossed onto sizzling grills beside cracked eggs, creating a salty, smoky breakfast that became deeply connected to blue-collar American life during the 1940s and 50s. At first glance, the meal looked ordinary. But during difficult economic years, bologna was one of the cheapest meats families could afford. Diners loved it because it cooked quickly, lasted longer than fresh meat, and could feed hungry customers for only a few cents. Many small-town restaurants served it with toast, hash browns, or grits alongside endless cups of black coffee poured into heavy diner mugs. Early each morning, factory workers, truck drivers, mechanics, and railroad employees filled tiny roadside diners before long shifts began. The sharp sound of bologna curling and sizzling on greasy flat-top grills became part of the morning routine across much of America. Some cooks sliced the edges so the meat would fry flat, while others let it puff into crispy bowls that children loved watching. For many Americans growing up during those decades, fried bologna carried memories of survival, comfort, and family kitchens where every dollar mattered. Mothers often recreated the same diner-style breakfast at home because it was affordable enough to feed several children before school. But by the 1980s, the breakfast started disappearing from menus. Processed lunch meats became less fashionable, and younger generations viewed fried bologna as poor people's food from an older America they no longer understood. Fancy breakfast chains replaced many old diners, and the humble meal quietly faded away. Today, hearing bologna crackle on a hot diner grill still sends some older Americans directly back to childhood mornings filled with coffee smells, noisy kitchens, and conversations before sunrise in towns that barely exist anymore. Part 06: Shaker Toast with Molasses Butter. In early American diners, especially across New England, there was once a breakfast so simple it almost feels forgotten by time itself: shaker toast with molasses butter. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't expensive, but it carried a quiet history tied to some of the most disciplined communities in American food culture. The Shaker communities, known for their simplicity and self-sufficiency, believed food should be humble, practical, and nourishing. From that philosophy came a breakfast that eventually slipped into small-town diners. Thick slices of bread toasted over open griddles, then spread with butter blended with dark, sticky molasses. The result was sweet, smoky, and deeply comforting. Inside 1940s and 50s diners, this breakfast often appeared on the simplest menus, usually alongside oatmeal, boiled eggs, and black coffee. It was the kind of meal served to early risers who needed something warm before a long day of factory work, farming, or travel. The molasses added a deep richness that sugar alone couldn't match, and for many families, it was one of the only affordable ways to enjoy a sweet breakfast. Children in rural towns often remember the smell more than anything else: warm bread, melted butter, and the earthy sweetness of molasses filling small kitchens on cold mornings. It was a breakfast that didn't rely on abundance, but on making the most of what little was available. As processed spreads, jams, and packaged breakfast foods became popular in the mid-20th century, shaker toast slowly disappeared from diner counters. It was too simple, too old-fashioned, and lacked the convenience of modern alternatives. Today, very few diners still serve it. But for those who remember, one bite brings back a quieter America, where mornings started slowly, food was handmade, and even the simplest toast could feel like comfort itself. Part 07: Creamed Corn on Toast. In many small American diners during the early and mid-20th century, there was a breakfast that often surprised visitors with its simplicity: creamed corn on toast. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't designed to impress, but it was warm, filling, and deeply tied to a time when breakfast was about survival, not variety. The dish was made by slowly heating sweet corn in milk or cream, thickening it with a bit of flour or butter until it became rich and velvety. Then it was poured generously over thick slices of toasted bread, often buttered while still hot. In some regions, a pinch of black pepper or salt was added to balance the sweetness, creating a comforting mix of flavors that filled the stomach for hours. During the Great Depression and the years that followed, corn was one of the most reliable and affordable crops in America. Families stored it, canned it, and used it in countless ways. In diners, creamed corn on toast became a quiet staple for workers who needed a cheap but energizing breakfast before long shifts in factories, farms, and rail yards. For many children growing up in rural towns, This dish was part of early morning routines. The sound of a spoon stirring warm corn on a stovetop, the smell of butter melting into toast, and the steam rising from simple kitchen counters created memories that stayed for life. It was not a meal of luxury, but of consistency and care. As America moved toward faster, processed breakfasts in the late 20th century, creamed corn on toast began to fade. It was considered too plain, too old-fashioned for modern menus. Diners slowly replaced it with pancakes, cereals, and packaged pastries. Today, it survives only in a few old-fashioned kitchens, but for those who remember it, the dish represents something deeper, a time when even the simplest ingredients could bring warmth to a hard morning. Part 08: Liver Pudding and Onions. In many early American diners, especially across the South and rural Midwest, there was a breakfast that carried both strong flavor and stronger memories: liver pudding with fried onions. It was never a dish made for comfort in the modern sense, but for nourishment during times when nothing could be wasted. Liver pudding was made from pork liver mixed with cornmeal, spices, and leftover trimmings, then formed into a loaf and sliced for frying. When placed on a hot diner griddle, the edges turned crisp while the inside stayed soft and rich. Alongside it, onions were slowly caramelized in the same pan, soaking up every bit of flavor left behind. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing years, this breakfast became a practical solution for working families. Offal cuts like liver were inexpensive and widely available, making them a reliable source of protein when other meats were out of reach. Diners served it with eggs, toast, and strong black coffee to truck drivers, mill workers, and farmers starting long, exhausting days. For many households, the smell of liver and onions cooking in the early morning kitchen became part of daily life. It was a scent tied to discipline, survival, and routine. Children often remember it vividly, not always fondly but always clearly, as part of growing up in homes where nothing was ever discarded. As decades passed, tastes changed. By the late 20th century, liver pudding began to disappear from most diner menus. Younger generations turned away from organ meats, associating them with hardship rather than necessity. Processed and lighter breakfast foods replaced it, and the dish slowly faded from public memory. Today, only a handful of traditional diners still serve it. But for those who grew up with it, liver pudding and onions remains a powerful reminder of an America where every ingredient mattered, and breakfast was never just about taste. It was about endurance. Part 09: Hoe Cakes with Syrup. In the early mornings of rural America, long before pancakes became fluffy stacks covered in modern toppings, there was a much simpler breakfast quietly served in farmhouses and small diners: hoe cakes with syrup. Thin, golden, and slightly crisp at the edges, these cornmeal flatbreads carried generations of history on every plate. Hoe cakes were originally made from cornmeal mixed with water or milk, then poured onto a hot iron skillet or griddle until they cooked into small, rustic rounds. Some historians trace their origins back to early indigenous cooking methods, which later blended into Southern American food traditions. By the 1800s and early 1900s, hoe cakes had become a common breakfast across farming communities. Inside old roadside diners during the Great Depression and post-war years, hoe cakes were often served when ingredients were limited. They required almost nothing, just cornmeal, heat, and time. Despite their simplicity, they were filling enough to sustain farmers heading into long days in the fields and workers preparing for physically demanding jobs. Families often drizzled them with molasses or maple syrup if they could afford it. In poorer households, sometimes only a bit of butter or even pan drippings were used. The taste was humble, but for many, it represented comfort during difficult mornings when food was scarce and the future uncertain. For children growing up in those times, hoe cakes were often their first warm breakfast of the day. The sound of batter hitting a hot skillet, the smell of cornmeal browning in butter, and the sight of steam rising from simple plates became part of everyday memory. As modern breakfast culture evolved, hoe cakes slowly disappeared from mainstream diners, replaced by pancakes, waffles, and processed mixes. But in a few rural kitchens, they still survive, carrying the quiet memory of an America where breakfast was simple, practical, and deeply tied to survival. Part 10: Egg Coffee and Hard Bread Breakfast. In the final chapter of Forgotten American Diner Breakfasts, we come to one of the strangest yet most historically revealing morning traditions, egg coffee paired with hard bread breakfast plates. It sounds unusual today, but in certain immigrant-influenced diners of the early 20th century, this combination was surprisingly common. Egg coffee was made by cracking a raw egg into finely ground coffee, sometimes with the shell included in older rustic methods, then slowly simmering or steeping it until the mixture became surprisingly smooth and rich. The egg helped settle the grounds, creating a clear, strong brew with a deep, almost creamy texture. For early laborers, it was not about taste alone. It was about strength, energy, and survival before a long day of physical work. Alongside it, diners often served hard bread or stale toast revived with butter, drippings, or simple broths. Nothing was wasted. Bread that had gone dry was still considered valuable, especially in homes that had survived economic hardship or wartime rationing. In many small-town eateries, this breakfast was served quietly to workers who needed something fast, filling, and affordable before sunrise. During the early industrial era and the Great Depression, meals like this reflected a deeper reality of American life. Food was not abundant, and creativity often replaced comfort. Diners became places where every ingredient was stretched, reused, and respected. As the decades passed, modern coffee culture and processed bakery goods completely replaced these older habits. Egg coffee vanished from most menus, and hard bread breakfasts were forgotten as freshness and convenience became priorities. Today, only fragments of these traditions survive in historical records and rare family memories. But they remind us of a time when breakfast was not about luxury or choice. It was about getting through the day one simple, determined sip and bite at a time. Before we close this journey through forgotten American diner breakfasts, take a moment to imagine all the lives behind these meals. Not just recipes on a plate, but real mornings. Factory whistles before sunrise, tired hands pouring coffee into chipped mugs, and families gathering around simple food that somehow carried them through the hardest chapters of history. From creamy gravies to cornmeal traditions, from humble toast to survival meals that stretched every ingredient, each dish we explored today once had a place in the heartbeat of everyday America. But time moved forward, tastes changed, and these breakfasts slowly faded into silence, leaving only memories behind. And maybe that's what makes them powerful today. They remind us that food is never just food. It holds stories, struggle, comfort, and identity all at once. Somewhere in those forgotten diner kitchens, an entire generation once found warmth before facing the world outside. If this story stayed with you, make sure you're part of America's Lost Recipes so you don't miss the next journey into the forgotten corners of food history. There are still many untold meals, hidden diner stories, and vanishing traditions waiting to be rediscovered. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these forgotten breakfasts surprised you the most? And if you could bring just one of them back to modern diners, which would it be? Leave your thoughts in the comments, like the video if you want more deep food history like this, and subscribe so we can continue uncovering the meals America almost forgot together.